Welcome to a new series on the ds-incubator. Today we're going to be talking about a bunch of topics covered in the book What They Forgot to Teach You About R by Jenny Bryan and Jim Hester. This book has a bunch of things that are not necessarily learned in workshops and things like that. So, but impact very strongly your life as a person who works with code, either if you are an analyst or a developer. So the goal of the series, and this comes literally from the book, is to build a holistic and project-oriented workflow that addresses most of the common sources of friction in data analysis, outside of doing your statistical analysis itself. And these things that you will be able to do at the end of the workshop, I'm going to mention them later as part of our objectives. So I'm going to move on to the audience, which was very nicely expressed explicitly in the book itself. So the target learner of the book is someone who has a moderate amount of R and RStudio experience, someone who is largely self-taught, someone who suspects that have drifted into some idiosyncratic habits and that may slow them down or make their work more brittle. And someone that is interested in redesigning their R life to be more effective and more self-sufficient, which I think is most of us at 2 degrees. So analysts, developers at 2 degrees, I think most of us fit in all this description. So I think this is a good content to cover in a series. We have covered some of the ideas in this book before, but very loosely. So this time I want to make sure that we are not missing anything important, and hopefully the materials here will also be useful for people who are onboarded to 2 degrees, so that they have like a series of lessons that they can use to know what we expect from ourselves. So the reason why this is important is because by addressing those causes of friction, we should be able to work faster, more effectively, and our work should be a bit more robust. So today the meetup is about the first section of the book, which kind of has the soul and the core of the content, which is this idea of the holistic workflow. I listed here a very ambitious number of objectives. I don't think we're going to have any time to cover them all, but hopefully to cover some of them, maybe these first 4. So I will be trying to talk about why how to set up R so that you always start from a blank slate, and then you're forced to save the source of your code and not the products, the artifacts from your code, your workspace in R jargon. Also, we're going to try to understand why restarting R is a lot better than running the function rm for remove, which you can use to do some but not all of the cleaning that you need when you want to start from fresh. And then understand why using a project-oriented workflow is a better idea than using setwd to change working directories from one to the other. And hopefully also try to understand how the here package can help you, particularly if you use R Markdown documents. I guess those 4 topics could be enough for today, but if we have more time, we'll continue to move on. Otherwise, we'll continue on the next session. So, as usual, there is repository on GitHub in the 2 degrees organization, and the repo starts with a ds dot prefix so that you can find repositories related to ds-incubators, so ds for data science, and then WTF is the name of the series, so it's going to be with us for a few meetups. So today we're going to be talking about holistic workflows, so you can scroll up and find the folder for chapter 1 for meetup number 1, which may be number 1 and 2, I guess. And here we have the materials for today. So in today's document, you will see a little later that I'm using the fs package a little bit and the here package a little bit. when I run library here, you also see, I mean, we're gonna learn about the here package in a moment, but already noted that what it's saying here is that it's aware of what is the root of the project that hosts the document that I'm running here. So it's aware of this folder called ds.what I forgot, .utf. So that's something that we're going to be coming back to in a moment. So all these headings come literally from the book. So maybe I should kind of click on one to show you where it takes you. In general, beyond the ds-incubator, I strongly recommend this book. I think it contains a lot of wisdom that is hard to get elsewhere, and it's all condensed in one very friendly to read book. So I'm trying in this series to highlight the most important things so that you don't have to bother reading it by yourself. But if you do want to take that time, I think it's gonna be worth gold. So the first subsection of the first part is this idea of saving the source and blank slate. So in R, by default, R will ask you if you want to save your workspace. So for example, if you have some objects created during a session, and then you exit R, by default, R will kind of give you the chance for you to save those objects that you created in that session. And then next time that you restart R, we'll try to find that workspace and reload it. That is a bad idea because it doesn't force you to keep the source. You could potentially keep the artifacts of the source, but then you may drift to a place where you cannot reproduce with code the workspace that you are now working with. So you are basically shooting yourself on the foot. So how you force yourself to always save the source? Well, by always starting from a blank slate. So if every time you start your R session, there's nothing in there, you are forced to save the source so you can reproduce the artifacts of your code every time. So we're gonna learn now how to do it in RStudio. So by clicking or unclicking this box here in the options section, I'm going to show you RStudio in a second, and by putting this drop down menu to never, you will be asking R to not reload your workspace, this line here, to not reload your workspace from an R data file that might have been saved previously. And then by putting here never, you could be asking R to not save the workspace at all. So in RStudio, this is what that looks like. You can go to Tools, and then you go to Global Options, and right there, the very first page is that the one that you have to kind of check, right? So where it says Workspace, make sure that this is unchecked. By default, unfortunately, it comes checked, so you have to uncheck it. And here, in where it says never, that's something that I put and I recommend you to put, but usually I think the default is ask, so you have to change it to never. So I'm gonna pause here because I heard the hands up sound, so let me cancel here. Let's see your beautiful faces. Anyone has a question or comment here?
As I
Can you hear me now? Honestly, I don't know. It's historical reasons, I guess. I'm tempted to ask Alex just to name someone here in the meeting, but if someone else knows the history of that setting, I would love to hear. I suspect, based on other, I mean, this is a total guess, but based on other historical things that have been dragged in R for ages, like for example, the default strings as factors equals true, that has changed in R4. It took 4 versions of R to get rid of that. I think that made sense at the time to save computing time because factors in some kind of analysis were faster. No longer that's the case, so that is sensible to now get rid of that. But I think that if you have a computer that is very slow, think 20 years ago when R started, the 20-something, 25 now maybe, maybe maybe it is a good idea to keep your workspace because it would be so hard to reproduce. I don't know, and maybe because also it was, you were supposed to be a very hardcore programmer if you were using R 25 years ago, and maybe you would have like programmers practices that were very defensive anyway. So maybe saving the workflow. Okay, you are not forced. I mean, by not saving the workflow, you are forced to keep the source. But if you have a good practice anyway, you can keep the source and keep your workspace. So it wouldn't really hurt yourself if you keep the source. But then you can drift to this pattern where you forget to save the source, right? So yeah, there's nothing religious about not keeping the source other than it really forces you to display the good practice of saving the source, right? So yeah, it's an unpleasant, I don't know, but yeah, hopefully in this discussion illuminates some of the ideas. Anything else? I'm gonna go back to here. And I really would like this dynamic in this series. I'm not interested in rushing too much, especially in section 1 of the book, which I believe is fundamental to every R user these days. No matter if you are a developer, if you are an analyst, or whatever you want to call yourself, I think knowing these little things, unfortunately, they tend to come too late in your R life, and by then you kind of hurt yourself a lot and you felt a lot of friction. So you may even think, as I thought when I started R, this is certainly not for me because I experienced so much friction, and then you realize, okay, life, you even get used to that friction and you think that, okay, it has to be hard, right? Because it's programming, that sounds like something hard. And then you realize that once you embrace the practices that are conventional and the practices that are best practices, you realize that the friction goes away. You can engineer the friction away of your workflow by following these practices. So now we are at the point where I would like to highlight what's the best way to start from a blank slate. So we now learned that, okay, we ask R to not save our workspace, but then when we work, we will be generating some artifacts of our code, and sometimes we change the code and the objects that we created are still hanging around, and we may think that the code reproduces the artifacts that we have, but in reality they don't. The code that we had before was the one that produced the artifacts, and now we have changed the code and we haven't updated the artifacts. So to avoid that problem, it is a great idea to restart R often. And by often, I mean many, many, many times. I usually try to write my code so that I can basically restart R and refresh the entire analysis every time I change some meaningful piece of code that I'm not 100% sure that produces what it produces, right? So that means maybe in an hour I'm restarting my R session 20 times or something like that, a lot, very frequently. It could be a different number for you. There's nothing magic on that. How you do that? Well, you can do it with the menus. Go and click in session and restart R, something like here, session, restart R. But there is a keyword shortcut. So because this is such an important part of your workflow, it's very important to memorize that keyword shortcut. I think for Mac users, the keyword shortcut became a little more friendly, right? Anyone here using Macs can tell me which is the keyword shortcut, the new one for restarting R? I mean, I think they by default, the new versions of RStudio have another one, but I'm suspecting that they might have left the old one there too, which kind of makes sense because in different platforms it's the same thing. So Shift Control F10, and that will refresh everything, right? So if you're thinking, well, but my computations take a long time to run, so if I do that every time, I will never finish my work. Okay, then there are some strategies to deal with that that we're going to cover later. But still, you will be able. Once you embrace those practices, then you will be able to also to restart your session, and some objects will be kind of cached, will be saved and reused when you need them, as opposed to recomputed if nothing changed in your code. So there are some systems that are smart enough to notice if something meaningful changed, and if it did, they will, the objects will be recomputed, and if they haven't, then not. So the practice is not to not restart your R session, the practice is to learn what are those tools that allow you to restart your R session and avoid recomputing things that do not need to be recomputed. Okay, so in addition to this super important, maybe crucial keyboard shortcut, Ctrl-Shift F10, then there are a few others that I listed here for you to explore. It's this idea that if you have an R script, for example, you can run the entire file with Ctrl-Enter, or maybe you just want to run all the code above of the line that you are standing on, and then you can press Ctrl-Alt-B, or you want to run just a selected line. Actually, sorry, I was highlighting the wrong code. So let me show you what that looks like a little bit. So if this is an R file here, let me make this a little bigger. Right. So if I am in line 2, and if I press, let's expand this a little bit too. Let me restart my R session, Shift Ctrl F10. Here it says restarting R. I also like to clear the console. I'm going to press Ctrl L to clear that up, and maybe now I can press Shift Ctrl F10 again. So if I am in line 2, and I can change the focus to my source file pressing Ctrl 1, and then I move my focus to here, and then if I press Ctrl 2, I move my focus to here, right? So if I'm in line 2 here, if I press Shift Ctrl Enter, everything runs. So in the console you can see number 1, number 2, and number 3. Right? So that's one keyboard shortcut that is pretty useful. But sometimes you don't want to run everything, you just want to run everything up to the line in which you are. So if I'm in line 2 and I press, is it Shift Ctrl B? Let me go back to my file here. Ctrl Alt B will run. Let me clear that up, the console. If I am in line 2, Ctrl Alt B runs 1 and 2, but not 3. So that's pretty useful because generally, you are changing code on top, seeing if, what's the state at this point, and then continue later. And then another couple of good ones are Ctrl Enter will run the line where you are and will move the focus to the next one. So you can press Ctrl Enter, Ctrl Enter, Ctrl Enter one by one. Or if you want to run, in this case, line 2, but not move your focus to line 3, then you can do Alt Enter. And then number 2 always runs, but your cursor stays in line 2. Okay, so we are at 20 past. It's the time where Faria will kick me out. Let's stop. Let me finish with this little section just to highlight that thank you. In R Markdown, the keyboard shortcuts are different. Sorry. So when you are using R Markdown files, which are this other flavor of R script, where you can intermingle code and prose, something like hello, and then you have code, then the story is a little different. So here in this drop-down menu in Run, you have a bunch of options. So instead of spending a lot of time, I encourage you to look at them. If you want to do the equivalent to Ctrl Enter in an R script and go line by line, for example, you would do run next chunk. So I would run this chunk with Ctrl Alt C, then press Ctrl Alt N, and that will kind of make me jump from one chunk to the other. And then there is a bunch of other tricks that you can learn here so that you can use your keyboard to send code to the console very comfortably, either if it's everything in your script, everything above, everything below, or exactly where you're standing at. So I invite you to look at that or revisit this file. So I'm about to talk about something quite important, but it's more important first to hear questions if there is any, or comments, so please go ahead. I'm gonna put your beautiful faces here. Okay, I don't hear any question or comment now, so maybe I'll move on a little more. We talked about restarting R, and I have seen and I have used this command rm. When you do rm and the argument list, you equal that to ls. What it does is it looks into everything that you created in your workspace, in your global environment, every object that you created there, and it removes it from there. So for some people, that is the way that they use to kind of clean everything up and start from scratch. But the problem with that, it makes your script vulnerable to some hidden dependencies, such as options that you change during your script that are invisible because they are not recorded in your script itself, or maybe to packages that you attached when you call library whatever tidymers. When you do rm list equals ls, you are not getting rid of those dependencies. Those packages are still attached. So you may think that now I'm going to start using the function filter from the package, the old package player, which I discourage you to do, thinking that that's what you're using, and instead you're using dplyr from a package that you attach in the before you run rm list ls. So the problem with rm list ls is generally that it doesn't do what you think it's doing. So it doesn't clear everything up. It just does a very superficial cleansing only of the objects that live in your global environment. So there is a bit more information here. One aspect that does not change is your working directory. And that is useful to mention because we are now about to talk about project-oriented workflow. So if you do rm list equals ls, your working directory will be whatever it was before you run that command, which is different to what happens when you launch an entire project, which does restart your R session. You start from a blank slate if you set up RStudio, as I showed you at the start of this meetup, and sets up the working directory at the root of the project. So let's start defining what a project is. If it's something so cool, we should learn a little bit more about that. So how about now? Any comment or question about RM? I know that that's a very controversial thing, so maybe some of you have comments here. And just to clarify, I think the controversy doesn't come from me or the community in general not being convinced that it's a generally bad practice. It comes from legacy, from a lot of people use it, and we are sometimes resistant to changing our practices. There is very good use of that too. So if that exists and you're using it correctly, then carry on. But also please pay attention to what's coming next, which is this idea of a project-oriented workflow. Because if you know the stuff that is about to come and you continue to use RM in a way that works for you, then great. But if you do it because you don't know the stuff that we're about to talk about, then hopefully your R life could improve a little bit. Monica, I hear you have a hand up. Go ahead. That's a great one. I think I felt it, but my addiction to restarting R is so great that I tend to restart. So let me say what you said again, because unfortunately there is some background noise, so I'm using my earplugs, so your voice is not recorded in the video, so I'm going to say what you said. So when you're using DevTools and you run a function interactively as opposed to say through DevTools test, there is objects that are being accumulated in your global environment, and then when you run our DevTools document, for example, you get a message, I believe, that tells you, or a warning that tells you that you can't do it. You need to first remove that object from your global environment and asks you to, or prompts you to do it with RM. Honestly, I think I just restart everything, particularly in another package that everything is so designed to start from a blank slate every time. But I should pay a bit more attention because I haven't yeah, I don't think I read too much in detail that message. I see someone who posted something. Maybe you, Monica, want to explain more? Because maybe you can explain more about this issue. Yeah. Yeah, cool. Yeah, I think I would like to use this as to kind of reinforce the idea that it's not a bad thing, right? So the tool itself, if it's used well, then it won't hurt you, right? So I think that what you just said, Monica, is one good use maybe of RM list ls. So I think it's fair to say, hey, it's not that you have to abandon it. You have to just not use it in thinking that it will cleanse everything. So if you're aware of that and still in your use case it makes sense, then continue using it. I guess that's the only takeaway that I could take. But in general, what I observe is that if you face something like this, it's once every so often, it's a very different scenario than thinking, okay, I have that function in every single script of my work. So if you find yourself using it too much, maybe it's a signal that you could use a different workflow that will improve your life a lot. So Faria says that she also experienced the same thingy, and next time I experience it, I will pay more attention. I often work in a very automatic pilot when I'm developing packages, and I kind of intuitively restart. Thanks a lot for that comment, Monica. Yeah, go ahead, Faria. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, that illuminates something. So Faria, I'm going to reset what you said again for the earphones thing. So Faria says that the times that she remembers experiencing that is when she's using scripts interactively, creating some objects on her global environment, and then calling DevTools herself, DevTools load all herself, which will try to load everything in the package, and then it gets this error saying that you can't do that because you already have objects in your global environment. I think the light that I see there is that the workflow that DevTools proposes assumes that you always start from a blank slate, and that should be your assumption every time that you run a script. So you should run a script so assuming that it's going to run from a blank slate. So DevTools embraces that practice so strongly that doesn't let you continue, right? So I'm kind of a little surprised and curious to do it myself to see, kind of try to figure out why they could say remove it with RM as opposed to please restart R and do it again, right? I think when you read the developer of DevTools is Hadley Wickham, and when you read his workshops, which I attended once in person, the workflow that he suggests is like you restart R, and then you do DevTools load all with Shift Control L. So that practice of restarting and loading could avoid this, because by restarting you would get rid of all those objects in your global environment. So yeah, I'm super curious to know why they would, instead of asking you to restart, they could ask you to do RM. Maybe because it's a bit more conservative. So even if you're somehow shooting yourself on the foot, they're not asking you to do something that would wipe out things that maybe were very valuable to you. If it took, imagine there's a computation that took an hour for an object to create. So I don't know. I'll pay more attention and try to bring some light next meetup. For now, I think I'm gonna thank you because we are beyond the time. So next time we are gonna, it's kind of a good starting point, because next time we're gonna start talking about project-oriented workflows and how they are implemented in IDEs such as RStudio, why that workflow can completely get rid of your setwd calls in your Ash scripts. All right, any departing comment before we go? No question? Okay then, thanks a lot. See you next time. Ciao, ciao.